The alarms at Fort Calder Regional Medical Center started screaming at 2:47 in the afternoon, and nothing about that day would ever be normal again. Nurse Maddie Cross had been on the job for exactly 11 days. 11 days since she'd pinned on her ID badge with hands that still shook every time she drew blood. She was 24 years old, fresh out of her residency program, and until that Tuesday afternoon, the biggest emergency she'd handled was a broken wrist from a Little League game. Nothing in her training had prepared her for what came screaming through the ambulance bay doors that afternoon. 7 Marines. A training accident at the nearby base had gone catastrophically wrong, a transport vehicle rollover on a live-fire exercise route, followed by a secondary explosion that nobody yet understood. The details didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that 7 men in uniform were being wheeled in on gurneys, and the ER was short-staffed because it was shift change, and the attending physician was still 4 minutes out from the hospital, stuck in traffic that had backed up because of the very accident that had sent these men to her. Maddie stood frozen for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds where every instinct in her body told her to find someone more qualified, to step back, to wait for backup. And then something inside her locked into place, something she didn't know she had. She grabbed the first gurney herself. Sergeant Danny Ruiz, 26 years old, a shard of shrapnel buried 3 inches from his femoral artery, blood pooling fast on the white sheet beneath him. If that artery had been nicked, he had maybe 4 minutes before he bled out. Maddie's hands stopped shaking. She barked orders to 2 other nurses like she'd been doing this for a decade: pressure here, for line there, someone get me a trauma kit and clear Bay 3 now. She packed the wound herself, her fingers finding the exact pressure point her instructors had drilled into her 100 times in simulations that had never felt real until this second. Ruiz would live. She moved to the next gurney before she even let herself register that fact. The next hour blurred into something that felt less like memory and more like muscle. A Marine named Okafor had a collapsed lung, and Maddie's hands trembled for exactly 1 second before she remembered the needle decompression procedure step by step, saw the chest rise again under her palms, heard him gasp in a breath that sounded like the most beautiful sound in the world. Another Marine, barely 19 years old, was going into shock, his skin gray and clammy, and Maddie recognized the signs before the monitors even confirmed it, got fluids running, kept talking to him in a low steady voice so he wouldn't panic, so his heart rate wouldn't spike further. She moved from bed to bed, triaging with an instinct that felt almost inherited rather than learned, calling out vitals, correcting a resident's dosage calculation on painkillers before it became a dangerous mistake, stitching a gash above one man's eye with stitches so clean the attending surgeon would later stop and stare at them twice. By the time the on-call trauma team fully mobilized and the ER filled with the doctors who should have been there from the start, Maddie Cross had already stabilized all 7 Marines. Every single one of them would survive. The chief of emergency medicine, a hardened veteran named Dr. Okonkwo who had worked 2 decades of trauma cases, walked the floor afterward in stunned silence, checking Maddie's charting, her interventions, the timeline of what she'd done in that first impossible hour before backup arrived. He'd seen residents freeze. He'd seen experienced nurses freeze. He had never, in 20 years, seen a rookie 11 days into the job perform like she had a decade of battlefield trauma experience already coded into her hands. When he finally found her in the break room, peeling off blood-soaked gloves with a blank, exhausted stare, he asked her the question that would end her ordinary life forever: "Maddie, where did you learn to do that?" She didn't have an answer. That was the strange part, the part that would keep her up that night staring at her ceiling. She genuinely didn't know. It had felt like remembering something rather than learning it in the moment, like her body knew a language her mind had never been taught. She told Dr. Okonkwo it was just her training kicking in, adrenaline, instinct, the things nursing school prepares you for. He nodded slowly, but something in his eyes told her he didn't quite believe that answer, and neither, if she was honest with herself, did she. The story didn't stay contained to the hospital walls for long. One of the Marines' family members posted about the young nurse who had saved their son's life, and within hours the local news picked it up. By the next morning, national outlets were calling. "Rookie nurse saves 7 Marines in one impossible hour," the headlines read, and Maddie's photograph, exhausted, blood on her scrubs, hair falling loose from her ponytail, was suddenly everywhere. She should have felt proud. Part of her did. But underneath the pride was something colder, something that had been growing since the moment Dr. Okonkwo asked his question and she couldn't answer it. Because deep in a part of her mind she rarely visited, in the blank space where her memories before the age of 12 should have been, something had stirred awake during that hour in the ER. A flicker of something that felt less like a nurse's training and more like a memory of doing exactly this before, somewhere else, under circumstances far darker than a hospital hallway. 3 days later, 2 black sedans pulled into the hospital parking lot, and 2 federal agents walked through the same ambulance bay doors the wounded Marines had come through. They weren't there to thank her. They were there to ask about a version of Maddie Cross that didn't exist in any hospital personnel file, a version buried under a name she hadn't heard since she was a child, a version connected to a case the FBI had kept sealed for over a decade. Maddie's quiet, ordinary new life was about to unravel in front of everyone who had just called her a hero, and what the agents were about to reveal would make the chaos of that hour in the ER look like the calmest moment of her life. If you want to find out exactly who Maddie Cross really is and why the FBI has been searching for her for 10 years, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because Chapter 2 is where her past finally catches up to her, and nothing you're expecting is what actually happened. Special Agent Elena Marsh didn't smile when she flashed her badge at the nurse's station. She asked for Maddie Cross by a name that made Maddie's stomach drop before she even understood why, Sarah Whitfield. Nobody had called her that in 17 years. Agent Marsh and her partner, Agent Tom Reyes, walked Maddie into a small conference room usually reserved for family consultations, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. Maddie sat with her hands folded on the table, the same hands that 3 days earlier had saved 7 lives, and waited for the ground to stop tilting beneath her. Agent Marsh finally opened a thin folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It showed a military field hospital somewhere overseas, and standing in the middle of chaos, blood on her hands exactly like 3 days ago, was a girl who looked almost exactly like Maddie. The date stamped on the photo was from a conflict zone, 17 years earlier. Maddie would have been 7 years old. "That's not me," Maddie said, but her voice cracked on the second word, because some small, buried part of her recognized that hallway, recognized the exact tilt of that girl's head as she pressed her palms against a soldier's wound. Agent Reyes explained, carefully and without embellishment, that the girl in the photo was Sarah Whitfield, daughter of Dr. Elias Whitfield, a battlefield trauma surgeon who had run an unauthorized humanitarian medical unit near an active conflict zone. Whitfield had been controversial for one specific reason: he trained his own daughter, from the age of 5, in real trauma medicine, using her as an assistant during mass casualty events because he was chronically understaffed and, according to the file, because he believed a child raised inside real trauma response would develop instincts no classroom could teach. Sarah Whitfield had reportedly assisted in over 200 trauma interventions before her 10th birthday. Then, when she was 7, the unit's compound was attacked. Her father was killed. The surviving records showed a young girl pulled from the wreckage, treated for smoke inhalation and shock, and quietly placed into an emergency guardianship program that eventually became a sealed identity change, new name, new city, foster family in the Midwest, no memory retained of the event or the years before it due to documented dissociative amnesia following the trauma. That girl was raised as Maddie Cross. Maddie sat in silence as the weight of it settled over her like water rising past her collarbone. It explained everything and nothing at the same time. It explained the hands that moved before her mind caught up, the muscle memory of trauma care buried so deep it felt like instinct rather than training, the flicker of déjà vu she'd felt in that ER base surrounded by wounded Marines. It didn't explain why the FBI was here now, in person, with 2 agents instead of a phone call or a letter. She asked them directly, and Agent Marsh's expression shifted into something more serious. The attack on her father's medical unit 17 years ago had never officially been solved. It had been attributed to opportunistic militia violence at the time, but new intelligence gathered over the past 18 months suggested the attack had actually been a targeted hit, connected to a black market network that had been stealing and reselling advanced trauma medical supplies and equipment meant for the humanitarian unit, worth millions on illicit markets. Dr. Whitfield, it turned out, had discovered the theft ring shortly before the attack and had begun quietly documenting it. The agents believed he'd been killed to silence him, and that the only person who might still hold fragments of what he knew, buried in unreachable childhood memory, was his daughter. The reason they'd shown up now, 3 days after the hospital incident, wasn't a coincidence. A facial recognition sweep tied to an unrelated financial crimes investigation had flagged Maddie's face from a national news broadcast about the 7 Marines, matching it against a sealed federal file that had been dormant for over a decade. And more urgently, the agents revealed that 2 members of the original theft network, having tracked the same viral news coverage, appeared to have flagged her too. Someone had run a search on Maddie Cross's home address twice in the last 48 hours from an IP address the Bureau had already been monitoring in connection with the case. In trying to save 7 strangers' lives, Maddie had unknowingly lit a signal flare that revealed her exact location to people who had been searching for a 7-year-old girl's face for 17 years, a girl who might still, buried somewhere in her mind, remember something that could finally close their case and end their freedom. Maddie sat with the photograph in her trembling hands, looking at a version of herself she couldn't remember but somehow already knew was true. Agent Marsh offered her protective placement, a chance to disappear again into another sealed identity while the Bureau worked the case. But something had shifted in Maddie during that hour in the ER, something that went beyond fear. She thought about Sergeant Ruiz, breathing because her hands remembered what to do even when her mind didn't understand why. She thought about her father, a man she couldn't consciously remember but whose training lived permanently inside her muscles and reflexes, a gift he'd given her without either of them knowing it would one day save 7 lives in a hospital hallway thousands of miles and 17 years away from where he died protecting the truth. She looked up at the agents and said the only thing that made sense to her in that moment, she wasn't running again. If there were fragments of memory buried inside her, she wanted them out. She wanted to remember her father. And if remembering meant finally finishing what he started, meant putting away the people who had killed him and had now traced their way back to her front door, then she was staying, and she was going to help them build the case, one recovered memory at a time. The last scene closes on Maddie standing at her apartment window that night, hospital ID badge still clipped to her scrubs, watching an unmarked black car idle across the street for the second time that evening, her reflection in the glass overlapping with the ghost of a 7-year-old girl in a photograph she'd never known existed until that afternoon. 2 lives, 1 set of hands, and a truth about to surface after 17 years of silence. This is only the beginning of Maddie Cross's story, and if you want to see what happens when her buried memories finally start coming back, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because Chapter 3 is coming, and it's going to change everything you think you know about the nurse who saved 7 Marines in one impossible hour.